are seeing a trench warfare, which at the moment is pretty much stalemate. And one side gets an advantage somewhere, and then somebody else gets an advantage elsewhere. What is clear is that neither side, even the Russians, can generate the fighting power to make a decisive move that could topple things over. And I think that is why people are hoping now that that the Kremlin will realise that. But unfortunately, it's not so much the Kremlin; it's Putin. Putin knows that if he does not succeed to his aims, Russian dictators fairly live in happy retirement and collect their pension. So we've got to really know what Putin's all about. So any sort of capitulation by him at this moment, he knows, is the end of him as president of the Russian Federation. And there are no shortage of people in Russia who would like to take over. So nature of warfare it changes only with what sort of capability is used, but the fundamentals are still the same. And I think that's why I personally believe we are at this sort of stalemate that could only be broken by hopefully a ceasefire or some demonstrative action. On the Russian side, as I suggested, tactical nuclear weapons. On the Ukraine side, European NATO going full in behind. Or the Americans. If the Americans put their military might behind Ukraine, then Russia would very quickly collapse in its attack to Ukraine. And in a similar vein, if European NATO countries put their boots on the ground, that would happen again. I mean, we've slightly been seduced by Russia. Everybody thinking the Russian economy is massive and endless, but it's actually half the size of the British economy. And as far as when it comes to military capability is concerned, they've lost allegedly 4,000 tanks already. They've lost up to 1 million men injured and wounded. This is even on First World War scales, this is unsustainable. So unless any of those two things change on either side, that's why I sort of think we're in stalemate. And at the moment, it doesn't appear that either of those would change, and which is why let's hope that Trump's threat this week, as it were, to end the war this week happens. But I think all of those of us who've been following this war for the last 3 years, and particularly Trump for the last 3 months, we're not betting our house on it, sadly.
And as you say, there is this. The Russians do have this power to bring things to a halt relatively quickly then. In that case, is there a chance of the ceasefire maybe restarting or perhaps being extended? Ukraine were open to the idea, although, as you say, rightfully sceptical.
Well, I think we've really got to look at the Kremlin and Putin, what they've been saying. They have stated their aims very clearly, that they want to completely subjugate Ukraine to start with, and then the old Soviet states, the Baltics and elsewhere, Romania, Bulgaria, sort of thing. That is Putin's ultimate aim. He's been telling us this for years. The other aim is to decouple Europe from the US. Now, Putin thinks that he is achieving all of those. So why on earth would he want to go for a ceasefire? He's done a great job of decoupling the states from Europe, and the Steve Witkoff, the envoy to Ukraine, who seems to spend most of his time in Moscow, and even Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, recently have really been singing the Russian song and not the Ukrainian song. So, Putin, thinks that he's very much on the front foot, and why on earth would he go for a ceasefire? So, with Trump initially saying he'd end the war in 24 hours before he became president, and then with these sort of sequential claims that he's going to end the war, apparently he's going to end it this week. That might be in his own mind, but he's obviously not listening to Putin, and he seems to be encouraging rather than discouraging Putin's thought. So, of course, there is a chance to the ceasefire, because that's, the Ukrainians are prepared to do that. But what they're not prepared for is an unjust ceasefire. And I think the European NATO countries are not prepared to allow Ukraine to go into an unjust ceasefire. And certainly a lot of the stuff being talked about at the moment from the negotiators like Witkoff and Rubio, you could sort of think that the Russians might agree to it, giving up Crimea and giving up the four, totality of the four oblasts, which Russia has illegally invaded. Whereas really offering very little to Ukraine except to strip them of their rare earth minerals and hundreds of billions of dollars, worth of money that should be helping feed the Ukrainians rather than going into the pockets of Trump and his close allies.
And every time we see one of these ceasefires proposed, we often quite quickly afterwards, regardless of whether or not it's signed, see it be almost weaponized by Russia to try and make out to the Americans especially that Ukraine doesn't listen to ceasefires and they're attacking anyway. At what point do we reach a point where we get a crying wolf situation where Ukraine just won't trust any suggestion of a ceasefire because it will just be used against them?
Well, that is absolutely right. It was bizarre. Minutes into the ceasefire, Russia was claiming that the Ukrainians had ignored it, but of course at the same time, air raid sirens were going off in Kyiv and Kherson and elsewhere, and Russian missiles and rockets were raining down. Now, and it would seem, that probably the Ukrainians kept firing as well. I mean, there did seem to be, in a place like Kherson, there did appear to be a lot less far than had been usually the case. So, there was some mileage to it. But yeah, I think there is very little trust between Kyiv and Moscow at the moment, and quite rightly. We only, I think we discussed last week the horrendous attack in Sumy, which killed 34 civilians. Again, Putin has claimed he does not attack civilian targets. He doesn't attack schools and hospitals, but quite clearly he does. So that is a real challenge. And when we're hoping that Trump would be an honest broker in all of this, he is doing this deal as though he was buying and selling real estate, not as though he was trying to, save lives of civilians and innocent people caught up in this fighting.
And is there any reason, especially at this point, for these two militaries to halt fighting without a third party like the US enforcing any sort of ceasefire? I mean, is there precedent for that?
Well, I'm sure there must be precedent, but at the moment it seems very unlikely. It would appear that the Ukrainians are happy to cease fighting now, on because the actual fighting as such is pretty much stalemate. Few gains are made here, bit of ground taken here, lost there. We're very much at a similar position as we were in probably 1917 in the First World War. We've got 1,000 miles of contact line, ostensibly trenches facing trenches, and there is very little movement going on, and probably little prospect. I mean, the only way the Russians have made any ground in the last sort of 6 months is by the extensive use of chemical weapons, which we sort of may come on to. But as far as maneuver warfare, tanks steaming across lines and making huge gains, that is highly unlikely, because the Russians are not trained to do that sort of thing, and the Ukrainians probably just can't generate enough fighting power to do it. So we are pretty much deadlocked. So unless somebody goes to the extreme, unless, for instance, Putin decides to deploy some tactical nuclear weapons, it would seem unlikely that they are going to make huge strides into Ukraine. And it is unlikely that, Russia can hold on and keep fighting and fighting and fighting forever. So I think we are at a stalemate. But without somebody like the US to broker this peace, it seems, certainly not in Putin's mind to go for it. Because, as we discussed at the beginning, Putin thinks he's winning and he thinks he can still achieve his objectives. And if Trump is retreating to the west side of the Atlantic and focusing on, mainland USA and making America rich again, then he is going to want to decouple himself from Europe, I expect. So at the moment, Putin thinks that there is a chance he can achieve both of his aims, decoupling Europe from US. One could argue he's already achieved that.
And we did hear these warnings from Kiev about the possibility of a new Russian offensive in the east and south of Ukraine. But it sounds like, to your mind, the Russians really aren't ready to fight a new full-blown offensive.
No, I don't think they are. And I think the intelligence flowing into Ukraine for its deep strategic strikes is still pretty good. I must say they are getting a lot of it themselves. So the idea that if America again pulls the plug on intelligence, that's the end of Ukraine. That's not quite true. So I think Ukraine still has the ability to strike deep. It still has the capability, and a lot of it now in indigenous stuff they've developed themselves, long-range drones. So it's not all about US ATACMS and HIMARS and about British Storm Shadow, which are probably getting low. But the German decision to deploy Taurus is pretty significant, and I know that Britain has got behind that. But when it comes on to the possibility of Russia doing some big ground maneuver, I think that is highly unlikely, for the reasons that I've said about Ukraine being able to strike these build-ups, but also to do combined arms maneuver. This is tanks with drones, with artillery, takes a heck of a lot of training. And we now know, and when I trained my regiment to do this, it probably took 2 years. We know with the conscripts coming into the Russian army now, they're lucky to get a few weeks training, not months and years. So that would be, that's why I sort of discount it. The only operations the Russians are doing at the moment are at platoon level, which is about 30 men, or very occasionally at company level, which may be up to 60 or 70, and only for very short periods. So I think the idea that they're going to sweep up into southern Ukraine with thousands of tanks is just, that is not happening. That might be coming out of Russian bots as part of their propaganda and disinformation, but it's fiction. It would not happen. They do not have the capability to do it.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.